When Queen Elizabeth I took her final breath, the torches flickered low in the corridors of Whitehall, as if the very walls exhaled with her. The Virgin Queen, the last of the Tudor line, was gone, and with her a silence more deafening than mourning, not the kind of silence that follows death, but the kind that hints at unfinished business, secrets still breathing in the shadows. As her body lay cold beneath layers of regal linen, her most trusted courtiers stepped into her private chambers, expecting relics of sovereignty, ceremonial rings, gold-inked proclamations, the polished residue of power. But among the velvet-lined drawers and perfumed parchment, they found something unlisted in the royal inventory. A letter. No seal, no name, just waiting. The contents remain a mystery even to this day, its existence barely whispered in official records. Some say it was a confession, others a warning, but those closest to her, they said nothing at all. Their silence was not respect, it was fear. And to understand why, we must unravel the red-stitched pages of a life that began not in majesty, but in betrayal. The year was 1533, and England was a kingdom on fire, rebellion. Whispers of heresy, and the thunder of church bells torn from their roots. At the epicenter stood a woman who would be both queen and ghost, Anne Boleyn. Clever, dazzling, dangerous. She didn't just catch the eye of Henry VIII, she rewrote his destiny. For her, the king defied the Pope, shattered the spine of Catholic England, and carved a new church out of defiance. But the gamble had conditions. Anne had to give him a son. Instead, she gave birth to Elizabeth, a girl. A disappointment in a silken crib. The king's adoration, once volcanic, cooled into suspicion. Whispers swirled. Anne was a witch, a seductress, a poison in the royal bloodline. And by 1536, those whispers turned to screams. Anne was arrested, accused of incest, adultery, treason. Most charges so ludicrous they insulted reason itself. But reason had no seat at this court. She was beheaded on a scaffold while Elizabeth, barely 3, played unaware in the gardens. 11 days later, Henry remarried. 11 days. That's all it took to erase Anne's name from court and carve another into the sheets of state. Her daughter, now motherless, became politically inconvenient, a living reminder of a queen erased. Henry soon got the son he wanted, Edward, and Elizabeth. She became a shadow in her own palace, too royal to ignore, too dangerous to love. She grew up in a labyrinth of spies, poison goblets, false smiles, her survival not a birthright, but a daily battle of cunning and silence. She watched, she listened, she remembered. When she finally seized the throne in 1558, the crown did not sit lightly. It was soaked in blood and whispers. Her brother Edward had died young. Her sister Mary, Bloody Mary, to those who remembered the burnings, died childless and bitter. The kingdom was exhausted by religion, starved of heirs, and drowning in suspicion. Into that chaos walked Elizabeth, cloaked in gold and steel-aimed resolve. But power, especially in the 16th century, came with a grotesque price. You weren't just expected to rule. You had to embody perfection, and in Tudor England, perfection had a face as pale as death. Pale skin wasn't just a trend, it was a weapon. It meant nobility, purity, untouchability, and Elizabeth understood the stakes. In 1562, fate tried to strip her mask. Smallpox struck. The queen fell into a fever so violent that death stood outside her bedchamber more than once. She survived, barely, but the scars remained. Deep, jagged, pitted across her once luminous face. For anyone else, it would have been a personal tragedy. For Elizabeth, it was political suicide. A disfigured queen could not symbolize divine order, so she created a new mask, literally. Venetian ceruse, a poisonous lead-based makeup, became her armor. She layered it thickly, smoothing over every mark, sealing in her secrets. But ceruse wasn't just cosmetic, it was lethal. Over time, it poisoned the skin, eroded the flesh, and hastened aging. Yet Elizabeth continued. More layers, more powder, more illusion. Her portraits show a woman ageless, but the mirror showed a corpse in slow motion. Underneath the white paint, her face was decaying, her teeth blackened, her hair thinned. But still, she painted herself into a symbol, untouchable, eternal, virgin not by flesh, but by myth, because to admit frailty was to invite vultures. So she smiled through pain, she spoke in riddles, she hid her face behind lace fans and candlelight, and England worshipped her, not as a woman, but as an idea. Yet ideas cannot bleed, and behind palace doors Elizabeth bled in silence. No husband, no children, no true confidants, just spies, secrets, and ghosts. Ghosts like her mother, who haunted the Tower of London and whispered in the minds of those who dared ask if the crown was cursed. Ghosts like Robert Dudley, the man she may have loved, whose wife died under such strange circumstances that even now historians argue whether it was accident or murder. Elizabeth kept him close, but never too close. He remained her favorite, her sorrow. She ruled with brilliance, yet walked alone. And toward the end, the mask began to crack. The letters became darker, her speeches laced with melancholy. Her appetite faded. Some claim she heard voices, others that she spoke often to shadows. And then came the final night. March 24th, 1603. She refused to lie down, as if she knew what sleep would steal. For hours she stood, silent, surrounded by her ladies in waiting who begged her to rest. But the queen would not bend, not until her legs gave out and the light left her eyes. And when they opened that mysterious letter in her chamber, the one with no name, no seal, no explanation, they found words that none of them repeated, not even to their own souls, because history has its sacred silences. And Elizabeth? She took her final secret to the grave, beneath white lead and crimson robes. They buried her beneath Westminster, where kings and queens sleep in stone. But the air never quite settled after Elizabeth's death. There was something unspoken lingering in the corridors of power, a chill that clung to the tapestries, something older than crowns and colder than marble. The Virgin Queen was gone, and with her the last thread of a dynasty soaked in obsession, betrayal, and bodies stacked beneath velvet. But history didn't pause, it shifted. And as the Stuart era dawned under King James I, it came with its own set of horrors. The world was changing, but its appetite for secrecy and suffering remained savage. The age of enlightenment hadn't yet arrived. Science, such as it was, crawled hand in hand with superstition. And medicine? Medicine was often darker than the disease. Imagine a sick room in the early 1600s, a child, feverish, her body racked with tremors, her mother whispering prayers, while a physician, more executioner than healer, unpacks his tools, not syringes or antiseptic, but leeches, hot irons, and blades. Bloodletting was still the prescription for nearly every ailment, from toothaches to heartbreaks. Physicians believed the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and imbalance was deadly. The cure? Bleed the patient until they were emptied of sin, illness, or life itself. And if you were royal, the treatments were even more extravagant and horrifying. Monarchs were often fed concoctions brewed from crushed pearls, powdered mummies, or even human skulls, ground and stirred into wine. It was believed that vitality could be stolen from the dead. Cannibal medicine, they called it, but rarely out loud. The elite ingested corpse matter with the same detachment they reserved for executions. Power didn't flinch. And speaking of executions, public death was no longer a medieval novelty. It was spectacle, a moral theater. Hangings, beheadings, and burnings were performed like grim ballets. with crowds packing the streets to watch bodies snap and bleed. In 1606, just 3 years after Elizabeth's death, Guy Fawkes was dragged through the London mud and hanged for attempting to blow up Parliament. But they didn't let him die quickly. That would be mercy. Instead, they quartered him, cutting him open, tearing out his organs while he still breathed. The audience cheered. Children watched. Some vendors sold sweets. But the violence didn't end with justice. It bled into belief. Religion during the 17th century wasn't simply practiced. They say time buries truth, but some truths rot loud beneath the soil, pulsing beneath cobblestones and palace floors, refusing to be forgotten. As the reign of Queen Elizabeth III slipped into memory and the Stuart dynasty wrapped its fingers around the English throne, what followed was not peace, but a more polished form of madness. Civilization dressed itself in finer clothes, painted ceilings with angels, and penned sonnets about virtue and honor. But underneath the gold leaf and linen wigs, the sickness remained, evolving, adapting, hiding behind velvet curtains and candle smoke. The ghosts of the Tudors didn't vanish. They changed masks. And as the centuries stumbled forward, one era bled into another, each carrying new horrors stitched with the same black thread: the hunger for power, the illusion of order, and the bodies it demanded. King James I, for all his education and ambition, lived in a court soaked in contradiction. He believed himself divinely appointed, yet trembled at shadows. He burned witches in daylight and studied scriptures by candlelight. He feared women, adored young men, and believed that evil walked the earth in mortal skin. His obsession with demons wasn't just personal, it was political. It gave him control. And with his crown, England's war on the unseen deepened. The witch hunts escalated. Bodies swung in fields like scarecrows, accused by neighbors for nothing more than a crooked smile, a barren womb, a dead cow. One of the most infamous trials, the North Berwick witch trials, began with a storm at sea and ended with over 70 accused of sorcery, many tortured, mutilated, or burned alive. And these weren't villagers in some forgotten hamlet. These were men and women dragged before nobles, interrogated under royal orders, their confessions carved out with iron, and when they screamed, those screams were interpreted not as suffering, but as proof. But the sickness of the age wasn't confined to witches. It spread through every artery of royal life. While the peasants clawed for bread and prayed for mercy, the nobility waded deeper into strange rituals, ancient superstitions cloaked in civility. The obsession with blood, noble, untainted, and divine, led to practices that bordered on the grotesque. In some royal courts, it became fashionable for aging elites to consume the blood of young men freshly killed. The idea that youth could be absorbed, as if time could be stolen through death. They didn't drink it from goblets. No, it was soaked into cloth, powdered, dried, or mixed with wine, all in the name of longevity. And while that happened behind closed doors, outside the gates, England was choking on disease. The plague returned, not once, but again and again. Streets filled with corpses wrapped in bedsheets. If you coughed, people crossed themselves. If you smelled of illness, you were abandoned by your own children. Doctors dressed in bird-like masks stuffed with herbs to block the stench of rot, but their medicine, it was closer to magic than science. Burning sulfur, boiling vinegar, or carrying the heart of a dead toad in your pocket. Whatever it took to stay alive in a world that had no mercy for the weak. And in the midst of this terror, art flourished, because that's the cruel joke of history. Some of its greatest beauty is born from its worst agony. Theaters filled with laughter and sword fights, while outside, heads were impaled on spikes at London Bridge. Shakespeare himself wrote sonnets in the same city where heretics were boiled alive. It was an age of paradox, where love was inked into parchment and cruelty was carved into bone. But the elite, they remained untouchable. At least they believed they were, until one by one the protections began to crumble. King Charles I, grandson of Mary, Queen of Scots, and successor to James, pushed too far. His divine arrogance collided with a nation no longer willing to kneel. War erupted, brother against brother. Parliament raised armies against the crown, and for the first time in English history, a king stood trial, not in secret, not in whispers, but in broad daylight, and the verdict was death. January 3, 1649. They built the scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. Snow on the ground, crowds swelled in silence. Charles wore 2 shirts, not for style, but so he wouldn't shiver and appear afraid. He knelt, whispered a final prayer, and gave the signal. The axe fell. A roar didn't follow. Just stunned, uneasy quiet. Because something fundamental had broken. Kings weren't supposed to bleed like men, and yet he did. Crimson on white snow. The divine right of monarchs ended not with a war, but with a severed neck and an echo. And as the blade was cleaned, those who witnessed it knew. The ghosts were still watching. But perhaps the most disturbing truth of all is this. These events didn't vanish into dust. They buried them, certainly, smothered them beneath royal ceremonies, classical paintings, sanitized history books. But the sickness, the darkness that haunted Tudor halls and Stuart corridors, never left. It merely moved, through time, through bloodlines, through ideologies. It hid behind crowns, it whispered in churches, it smiled in portraits, and every so often it rises, in strange ways, in sudden cruelty, in collective madness. Because history, real history, is not a straight line. It loops, it pulses, it remembers. To what was in Elizabeth's final letter, the one left without a seal, without a name. Maybe it was a confession, maybe a warning, or perhaps it was something more terrifying, an admission that she, like those before her and those after, was part of something too old, too cruel, too vast to name. Maybe she saw it, felt it, knew that no amount of lead paint or ritual purity could cleanse what the crown demanded. Maybe she wanted someone, anyone to know, not just what she ruled, but what ruled her, what rules us still.